the champion of the Massachusetts tax revolt, next on 1 Norway Street. Welcome to this edition of 1 Norway Street. I'm Schuyler Sackett. Today, career consultant Janice Weinberg tells how to get the job you really want. Business analyst Bill Bruce describes the myths and realities of the 1980s most popular way to open a small business, franchising. And monitor film critic David Sterrett looks at the ways in which videotapes are changing the movie industry. But first, the Bay State's queen of tax reform. For years, taxpayers called Massachusetts Taxachusetts because of the state's high income tax levels. But a sweeping revolt 10 years ago gave us Proposition 2.5, and a big change in the tax system. One woman stood at the forefront of that tax-cutting movement, Barbara Anderson, Executive Director of CLT, Citizens for Limited Taxation. Ms. Anderson joins us now. Welcome to 1 Norway Street.
Thank you, Schuyler. Glad to be here.
Also joining us is George Merry, veteran political analyst for the Christian Science Monitor. George, it's good as always to see you.
It's nice to be back again, Schuyler.
Ms. Anderson, do you consider yourself the foremost advocate for tax reform in the state of Massachusetts?
I'm the loudest one. I'm the voice for people like me who 10 years ago didn't have a voice on Beacon Hill. So what our organization, Citizens for Limited Taxation, does is it represents the taxpayers as taxpayers on Beacon Hill so that people don't ever have to feel as helpless as I used to feel as a citizen of Massachusetts when there was no taxpayer group representing my interest on Beacon Hill. And please call me Barbara, okay?
Okay. Do you think that Proposition 2.5, nearly 10 years ago, was the biggest achievement of your group?
I think it's sort of an ongoing achievement. What we're trying to do is get the attention of people in power. We want to be players. We want the taxpayers, the voters, the people who provide the revenue for all the services to be players in the political scene instead of just people who have to pay the money and then the politicians go and do what they want to do. So 2.5 was the first step in what we see as an ongoing process of getting their attention, getting their respect, and being a part of the process. So with 2.5, we got their attention. Then we were involved in the rules reform fight, which gave us better representation, at least in the House on Beacon Hill. And now we're following through on that to do our state income tax cut this year.
I'm a relative newcomer to the state of Massachusetts. I'm very familiar with Prop 13 out in California, but Prop 2.5 is something I don't know a great deal about. Could you refresh our memory about what 2.5 accomplished?
Well, it did essentially what Proposition 13 did in California. It cut back property taxes and limited the growth of property taxes.
Was it more drastic than Proposition 13?
No, it was much less drastic than Prop 13. We looked at the Prop 13 experience. We realized that things were different in Massachusetts. For one thing, Proposition 13 is a constitutional amendment, and it cannot be changed unless the change goes on the ballot in California. Proposition 2.5 is a statute, can be changed any time by the legislature, and actually we've worked with the legislature for the last 9 years to make some sensible changes in 2.5. Also, Proposition 13 cut the property tax in California from 2.5% to 1% of fair market value, and they had 30 days to get ready for it. Ours was at 4.5% when we started. We cut it down to 2.5%, where Californians were when they were angry. And then slowly, gradually, we're cutting the property taxes. So it's a long process, a very gradual process, and was not as dramatic as Prop 13.
Barbara, have you found that Prop 2.5 in practice, now that it's been enacted, has worked out the way you anticipated?
It worked out the way we'd hoped. We had no reason really to anticipate that the Commonwealth, the political system, would respond as well as it did to Proposition 2.5 because they were the ones.
Why did they respond so favorably?
I think that our politicians, our government does respond when the people tell them very clearly what they want. And I think it's a sign of hope for the future, considering the mess we're in right now, that the system can respond as long as the voters send it a clear message.
But every legislative session, there's some kind of a bill in there, several bills actually, to weaken Proposition 2.5. Has it been weakened appreciably at all?
Not at all. It's been improved. I mean, you're right. The bills are filed, but the point I'm making is the bills don't get anywhere. That the majority of the House and even the majority of the Senate seem to support 2.5, and the changes that have been made, which we worked with them on, with just one exception, were changes that we approved and actually wanted, and that they've made the bill stronger and better over the last 9 years.
Does Prop 2.5, I believe, allows local communities to vote to exceed the limit? Is that correct?
That's the key part of Proposition 2.5, that if the community needs more money, wants more money, it has to ask the voters. And if the voters choose to give them an additional property tax allowance, then the voters can choose to do that. If the voters say no, then of course they don't get it.
Are more communities voting to do that as the state is cutting back on the amount of money that it's giving to local communities?
Well, actually, it was rather the other way. I mean, over the years, as citizens felt confident that 2.5 was theirs to keep, and the state seemed to be coming along nicely itself, and people were quite happy with the way things were, they were voting to give more money to their local communities, and there were a lot of overrides passing. This year, people have a sense that something's wrong in this Commonwealth, that somebody's not paying attention, and they're afraid, I think, of what's going to happen next year, what taxes might go up. So they've been actually cutting back on their approval for the property tax increases until they see exactly how well the system is going to get hold of the current crisis.
But with state aid to cities and towns being cut this year, unlike what's happened in past years with increased year after year after year, is there apt to be more of an effort to override at the local level as they desperately try to find money to prevent the one librarian from being laid off or some other awful thing happening back in the...
Oh, yes, absolutely. They've been trying more. I mean, the overrides have been out there. It's just that people are, I think, just a little uncomfortable with the situation in Massachusetts. They just saw their income taxes going up. Yes. They aren't willing to raise their property taxes arbitrarily again, as long as they have a choice about it, until they see how things are going to work out. I think once we get through this fiscal crisis, we'll get back on track with overrides passing based upon the importance of the project being asked for.
Tell me this, have the tax cuts in Massachusetts under Prop 2.5, have those resulted in innovative new approaches to providing services in Massachusetts, or have they just resulted in cutting back in services that were previously provided?
Some communities tried to cut back on services, and some of those mayors are no longer with us as political entities, so that didn't work. Most communities did an absolutely terrific job with Prop 2.5. The Mass Municipal Association, which opposed Prop 2.5, came out with a list of suggested ways to be more efficient at the local level within days of 2.5 passing.
What are some of those ways of being more efficient?
Well, they had recommended, and we have been recommending too, in our local level, that they have professionalized town treasurers, for instance, to deposit the town money in real bank accounts. Before Prop 2.5, a lot of town treasurers were depositing the money in now accounts, at 5%. So,
even in no interest accounts. Right.
That has stopped. That has stopped completely. Oh. And you now, in many cases, instead of having elected town treasurers, you have appointed town treasurers who are chosen for their ability to work the markets. That was one change. Another is consolidation of some purchasing. That's been done. So you've seen a lot of things really improving at the local level. The thing has been, though, that after 2.5, our economy became so strong, not just because of 2.5, but for a variety of reasons, that there was plenty of money for the state, for the cities and towns, for local aid. So in the middle of this economic boom, with all this revenue pouring in from our strong economy, both the state and the cities and towns were having a lovely time spending money. And they didn't really look ahead to see what would happen when we were back to normal. And then, of course, the presidential election got in between us and getting back to normal. And so now we're in trouble, mostly because they had so much to spend before, and they really weren't doing the belt-tightening that they really were supposed to be doing at both levels of government with Prop 2.5.
So what can be done now?
Now they're going to have to do it.
How are they going to do it, though? I mean, right now the tax bills are ready to go out in November. We hope they're ready to go out in November. And massive layoffs in cities and massive layoffs at the state are threatened, at least.
Yeah, you're talking about something different. I mean, we supported the House Ways and Means Chairman here, Richard Volk, when he wanted to level fund local aid this year because we thought that they could live with level funding. We never would have supported what the governor has done, which is simply crazy. To come in after the budget year is over, when they've already had their town meetings, they've had their city council budget debates. The budgets are together. They're moving into the budget year, and the governor comes in and cuts $200 million of local aid. That's insanity. I mean, that's just technically impossible to do. They would now have to go back and have town meetings over again. It was a crazy thing to do.
And there's no time for that.
There's no time.
You think that's going to mean that the tax bills are going to be a lot later than coming out this year, and therefore people will be hit with 2 tax bills within a calendar year instead of the single tax bill that they now get?
That could happen. It's simply chaos. And meanwhile, the legislature is going to court to try to take away the governor's authority to do conditional vetoes and to refuse to allow their override of his veto. We're in the middle of real chaos here, and it's a political problem, not a financial problem.
You filed a new legislation last night or yesterday that is going to make change in the way the budget is handled. What would that new initiative accomplish?
Well, our new initiative looks back at the last 2 years of fiscal irresponsibility here because of the presidential campaign, when our governor was off running for president and hiding the problems in the state. It tries to correct the ways that they tried to deal with the problems.
In what way, without being too technical, in what way does it correct? What would you specifically do?
One of the things that they did was they didn't pay their bills, their Medicaid bills, their nursing homes over the last several years, so they just passed an income tax increase, a 15% income tax increase, giving us the highest income tax rate in the country, and for an 18-month period. We're going to take that income tax increase and return it to the people after their 18 months is over. So in other words, they have created a 18-month, 15% income tax increase. When that expires, we will then have an 18-month, 15% income tax decrease. And we also have put in a provision to roll back fees to where they were last summer when our legislature turned over the decision-making on fees to the governor, and it'll give it back to them. And then we're going to say that if there are any new taxes between, or tax increases between now and the election next November, they will sunset automatically at the end of December of next year.
Barbara, I want to talk with you more about your new initiative, but we're going to take a short break. We'll be back with Barbara Anderson and George Merry right after this. Welcome back. We're talking with Barbara Anderson, Executive Director of Massachusetts Citizens for Limited Taxation, and with George Merry, our political analyst.
Barbara, you mentioned sunset, and that's, of course, an arrangement under which various state agencies and programs have to justify their existence periodically. Is that what we really need in Massachusetts, to have every single agency, or just certain agencies, justify their existence every 2, 3, or 4 years or whatever?
Well, for starters, I think it might be a good idea to have all of them justify their existence and try to set some priorities. And then you should have a regular review, I would think, of just how effective the programs are. And in fact, there is legislation in place to do that. John Finnegan, one of our state auditors before the current state auditor, has put together legislation to do this.
It's been in place for years.
They just don't do it.
It gets through the House sometimes, and it seems to die in the Senate. And yet, I guess about 35 other states have sunset for certain things. For instance, in Texas, they had the boll weevil commission. They discovered they didn't need anymore a few years ago. They got rid of it.
Does Massachusetts have any equivalent things?
If we had had a boll weevil commission, believe me, we would still have a boll weevil commission, even if we'd never even seen a boll weevil in our lives.
Barbara
Things
would
are
have gone
different
after
here.
it, I'm sure. Barbara.
We have a gypsy moth commission.
What programs could we get rid of? We obviously have to cut the budget. We just can't go on spending beyond our means. At least that would seem to be what we should be doing.
Well, our role, we see, with our 3-person staff, is to create a scenario in which they have to act, to put the pressure on in order to make them do the sunsetting, make them do the consolidations, make them do the better management.
But do you have any
they keep
specific
talking
recommendations, Barbara?
Oh, sure. There are lots of recommendations. Do I have an hour and a half here?
No,
Well,
no, but...
What's at the top of the list?
Yeah, what's at the top?
The top of the list, I think, is a restructuring of the Secretariat system, the system that has been put in place over the last several years, where we have a Secretariat for every conceivable issue, and then within the
9
Secretariat...
within the Cabinet.
And then, yes, and then within those secretariats, you have all these different commissions working on the same general project until the commissions don't even talk to each other. And if you're a client in need of a service in Massachusetts, you don't even know which agency to even start to go to because they're doing duplicative services. You have to start with a big picture structural item like that if you're going to have any real savings.
So you recommend cutting down on the number of administrations and streamlining the administration?
That's absolutely the part you're going to have to do in streamlining the bureaucracy. They're going to have to really get into the structure of Massachusetts government. Just cutting line items will not be enough.
But would you say that much by eliminating some of the elements of the Secretariat? There are a couple of secretariats that are really only one that spends a lot of the state's money. Beyond local aid, the Human Services Secretariat has a tremendous amount of money within this jurisdiction, and also education, which isn't even a secretariat anymore, as you know.
But if you take a look at what Human Services is and you put it in little boxes, it's all a little box for all these different agencies that don't necessarily relate to each other. For instance, in the area of employment training, which is supposedly such a big success here, you have all these different agencies, 13 of them, doing essentially the same thing and duplicating each other's services and not doing the job as efficiently, certainly, as it could be done.
Is that why we have had low unemployment in the state? Because there are all these agencies doing duplicate things and keeping people at work?
Sure, and one of the reasons our state employment, of course, has been going up is our unemployment has been going down. But another reason is, of course, that our population is very stable. People aren't necessarily in a big hurry to move to a place that is now becoming, again, Massachusetts.
Barbara, if we had only one tax that we had to increase, or perhaps impose a new tax, what would it be? There's no other way, let's say there's no other way to get around it. We have to have more money. What tax would you recommend?
Gee, Citizens for Limited Taxation does not exist to recommend tax increases, George. I think what we have here is the one good thing about our structure is we have a tax mix in Massachusetts, a little bit of everything. It's probably better not to over-rely on any one tax, and unfortunately, we have a very, very heavy hit on our income tax. Our income tax is 117% above the national average per capita, or 80% above relative to our personal income. It's too high. Our property taxes were too high. We now have them down to a reasonable level. Our sales tax, of course, is very low, but there's a reason for that. We have border states that people can go to do their purchasing, and you want to avoid encouraging them to do that. So our tax mix right now is fairly decent, but I think the level of taxation is already too high, and I certainly wouldn't recommend a tax increase.
What about allocating a specific portion of the state budget to local aid or to specific things rather than having it the way it is now?
I think in desperation, people are looking more and more toward earmarking because the government itself doesn't seem to be able to set its priorities, so people are trying to set priorities for them. Certainly a portion of the budget every year should go to local aid automatically because the cities and towns are not a state agency. They are co-providers of services. They're partners with the state, and it should be a little more stable as to how much money they get each year.
Barbara, you mentioned a moment ago that Massachusetts once again is becoming Taxachusetts. How do the taxation levels here in Massachusetts compare to other states?
Well, per capita, we've got the 5th highest total state and local tax burden in the country. Relative to personal income, it's still above the national average. The only determinant that has it below the national average is the sales tax, which has always traditionally been low because of New Hampshire sitting there with no sales tax. And we also have, if you throw in user fees, we're below the national average, so we're moving up very, very quickly here in user fees as well.
A broader sort of question about the philosophy of tax cuts. Don't broad, sweeping tax cuts tend to really end up in reducing human services? And don't they appeal to the kind of voter who is really, to the self-interest, selfish kind of voter who doesn't really care about the other guy's problems?
I haven't met many people like that. What people would like to see is the needy, as we call them, taken care of. The people are really getting tired of the needy being used as a way to raise more money from us in order to feed the bureaucracy. And I'm convinced that most of the people in this Commonwealth would cheerfully, happily, and willingly pay more taxes if they honestly thought they were going to take care of the retarded, the mentally ill, people who genuinely have problems, and particularly short-term problems that they could then grow out of and become part of the tax-paying system. So people believe in this. They simply don't believe any longer that our system is capable of taking their money and spending it on programs that the people agree are necessary.
Barbara, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
And thank you, George. It was fascinating seeing you again, as always.
Nice to be back.
Stay tuned. One Norway Street.